Hello, my name is Jean.
Well, I think it was. I think I was probably a bit late into the coming to some sort of understanding of what was going on. In that, I think it was COVID time, like 2020, and I I saw Kelly J. Keane being interviewed about a poster that had been up. I don't know if this is the right date, 2020, but a poster in Manchester, and it had got taken down because it was meant to be offensive. And all it said was woman, adult, female adult human. And I thought, how can that be offensive? How is that being allowed to be taken down? And she was talking to that Dr. Harrop, and I think it's quite a famous interview. And I thought, this can't be, how on earth is this going on? And then I started seeing that J.K. Rowling was being hounded and vilified, and I thought, I need, like she's transphobic and she was making life horrendous for trans people. And I had actually worked in an organisation that had a trans woman as a boss, and it had never really, I mean, that was previous, that was like 2014, 15, around then, and nobody was really. It took me a while to realise, that the person was trans because it was outside my scope. I did feel something wasn't right, and then when somebody said, I thought, oh yeah, that makes sense. I get it, but nobody was bothered about it. So I had that experience, and then Adrian Harrop and Kelly J. Keane, and then J.K. Rowling, and what was happening. And I read her piece, and she was so measured and so live your best life, and she wasn't coming across as a harridan and trying to sort of victimize poor souls as people claimed. And I thought, I need to get my story, well, my own head clear on this. I need to know where I am because it's not sounding right to me. And yet a lot of people that I would have said I was probably left-leaning, progressive, they were all saying, oh, this is transphobia and trans women are women, and if you don't believe that, you're a transphobe and a terrible person. And I was thinking, is that what I think as well? So, and another thing that did it, I was in a group, and it was during the COVID, a Sunday night discussion group with a social centre that had, various people that were quite left leaning in this, and I thought I would, and it was a time, I don't know the exact date. Do you know when it was the forensic bill where it was they'd had, you could request medical attention from a woman, but then they wanted it changed to female sex, and then there was a big outcry about that. And I thought, this is ridiculous as well. And I brought an article to that group.
So that was an article about the Forensic Medical Services Bill that had
Yes.
a loophole where trans-identified men could be allowed to examine female victims of sexual assault.
That's right. Yes. And we'd all we hadn't agreed about everything, but the hostility towards me that week, because it was actually an article written by Miranda Yardley, who is a trans woman, but he argues for third spaces. He doesn't want to invade women's prisons or rape crisis centres or anything like that. And the pushback from folk So all that kind of, and then I started to read, you know, and then the more I read, the more I thought, this is rubbish.
Have you always been a feminist?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I was at a girls' school, and I was brought up by, you know, my mum and my nana, and my granda, and they all thought women could do, you know, should have the chance to do whatever they wanted to do, really. It shouldn't be a barrier. There wasn't a barrier to, and my husband was always very pro-feminist. He, you know, when I got married in 75, I kept my own name, which was unusual in 75. And he wasn't like, oh, you know, he was like, no, that's great, you know, go on. So, yeah.
Don't you think it's extraordinary how women's rights have been eroded by all the trans nonsense?
Yeah, it has been. It has been, and I think that's why the contrast between that commemorative march in 2018 and then 2 years later they're ruling that women don't exist anymore, you know, basically, you know, as a separate sex class. You think, how, you know, how was that possible? Yes, well, I found him through Aberdeen. I found him through Aberdeen because a friend. I was in the independence movement in Aberdeen, which is also how I knew people from, you know, a wider sphere as well, and I'd made some very good friendship. You know. My friend Teresa, I don't know if she'll mind me mentioning her on this or whatever, but you know, Aberdeen based, and she invited me up to a panel that she was dressed in a dinosaur suit. I remember that night, and and she invited me up to Aberdeen, and I went to the panel. And it was very good. I think Caroline McAllister, am I allowed to say it? You cannot edit.
Yeah.
Caroline was on the panel, and a few other folk were there. And when I was there, I met this other woman, Fiona, who is often at Kelly J's rallies. You'll know Fiona. And she said, oh, if you're in Glasgow now, there's a picnic in Glasgow Green coming up, and you might want to go to that. And I thought, yes, I do. I can't remember the chronology, because I had also turned up at a picnic that had, not a picnic, a rally in Glasgow Green that Kelly J. Keane was at, Graham Linehan was at, and I can't remember if that, but I didn't know anybody there really, you know, I was just went on my own, because I also had started listening to The Mess. That was a big help to me, The Mess, with Graham and Helen Staniland and Artie Morty. I was a great listener to The Mess.
That was on YouTube, wasn't it?
Yes,
Podcast.
it was on YouTube, yeah. And that bolstered me quite a lot, listening to that. Anyway, I went to that picnic. I was wandering through the green looking for a group, you know, and Fiona was down from Aberdeen at it. I saw Fiona, and we got seated with some Edinburgh women, and afterwards we went to, you know, the pub in the green where the carpet farm Templeton's used to be, and Lisa from Edinburgh said, are you on, on anything? And I had tried to contact some groups, but I hadn't had anything back, Glasgow groups. And I said no, and she said, well, do you want to join our WhatsApp? And so I went in, and I'm still in the Edinburgh WhatsApps, and I've met some really good folk through that. And then, through that, then you start to hear about what's going on, and, to turn up at things, and yeah.
So you did manage to meet some other women that you could talk to?
Yes.
And was that a relief?
A big relief, yes, a big relief. Yeah, I had one friend here. She wasn't totally into it, but she did listen, and she kind of came around, I think, oh God, it's Jean on about that again, I've got old friends, in Aberdeen that probably thought, oh, I don't know if this has got anything more to me. But one of them said that she'd heard me being criticised by somebody else and about being over the top on this, a bit extreme and, too far. And she said, oh no, she said, I totally agree with Jean on this, I don't want my grandchildren indoctrinated, and, and I thought, oh, good, that's good. I was at a fish and chips supper quiz at an event, and I'd just not long been in Oxford and witnessed it. It was in Oxford the day that Kathleen Stock was speaking at the Oxford Union. And unfortunately, I didn't know in time, and hadn't, I would have loved to have got a ticket. I don't know if it was open to non-Oxford Union members. But I was aware that I saw the police horses there. I saw the police vans. I saw the crowd outside. I saw the signs saying, if you're affected by this, there is a safe room where we've got like teddies and dummies you can come and get, emotional support at. I saw for Kathleen Stock, and that the visual representation of that amount of hate and security needed. I mean, we've seen it. I mean, we saw it in Edinburgh, and we've seen it any time that we've been at rallies. You see it. But, for one person speaking at an Oxford debate, for them to be lines of police vans and police horses at the Oxford Union, which is meant to be free speech. And Kathleen is very measured in what she says, and anyway. So I was at this do, and I left actually, because I had brought up that I'd been there, and somebody opposite me said, well, basically saying she had, what would she expect having views like that? And I said something, and a bloke next to me said, you shouldn't be saying that. And I was so taken aback. I got upset and I had to leave. And I've been in these rallies and folks shouting fascist scum at me and things like that. But I was really, I couldn't believe I was there, and just saying it was ridiculous what happened to Kathleen Stock because of her beliefs, and being told, oh, well, if you have beliefs like that, what do you expect? And then also being told I shouldn't be talking about these beliefs,
Tell me about your experience of going to women's rights rallies.
The first one I went to was Glasgow, in, is it 2 years ago, 3 years ago? I can't remember.
February 23, wasn't it?
2023, that's right. That was the first big one. And I was scared leading up to it, because I think I said when I spoke at that rally that I, being a nationalist SNP person at that time, I had a subscription to the National, and I read about this transphobic group coming up from England to cause, fear to poor trans folk in Glasgow. And I thought, what are they on about? What is this? And then I read comments, and I think I've repeated this story several times. One bloke saying, "Oh, well, we should turn them back at the border, but if they get in here, we should club them like baby seals." And that was in a paper. So I think I've said this. I went to the police. I went to the police before, just across the road, and they were very nice, and they said, "Oh, well, we'll pass this on, but we're used to sectarian, we're in Glasgow, we're good at keeping folk apart." And they were far better than Edinburgh or Aberdeen or even Dundee, So I was worried going to that first. I wasn't sure how many would come out for Let Women Speak. And I went with Teresa, my friend from Aberdeen. And I must say, going there, I thought, oh, if this is what's being whipped up in the nationalist newspaper, what's going to happen? But, the police had the square, properly cordoned off, and it was absolutely fine. Once I got there, and there was a huge crowd for Let Women Speak, and it was great, and I was not frightened. Yeah, that was the first time I'd spoken at a rally, and I just decided a couple of days, a day or two before, and I was surprised because I wasn't coming. I think people got maybe a bit of relief hearing me speak, because there'd been some harrowing testimonies and it really opened my eyes to the women in prison. That the two women that had actually been imprisoned, hearing them, had a huge impact on me, and also hearing the young girl who had transitioned and then everybody loved her, and then she realised no, and then she was just dropped, and just the shallowness of it all, and how easily people can get sucked in, and so hearing all that, and then I come on, and I haven't got that kind of a tale to tell, I'm just speaking about, I had been at this suffragette memorial commemoration down Princess Street in 2018, and you just thought, oh great, we've made all this progress and things are looking up, and then push, it's all imploding, and then I beforehand I'd thought, you can't shove your granny off a bus, and I just started saying it, and folk joined in, and I think it provided a bit of a sort of contrast to think, no, these things are awful, but we're going to do what we can to stop this madness. We're not going to allow it to take over. That's what I felt anyway, and that's what I wanted to say that day.
Tell me about the time that Elaine Gallagher, the trans-identified bloke who is a Greens councillor at Glasgow City Council, after he talked in a Glasgow City Council meeting and called women who were at the Let Women Speak rally far-right, Nazi fascists, and the complaint you put in to the Standards Commission.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, that was that was a very positive experience that day, in George Square, and so many true and very, very valid, after Nicola Sturgeon saying, women's voices aren't valid, and all these valid voices saying, this is what's happened to me, I was in prison and I couldn't, my anxiety, my trauma, I've tried to access a rape crisis centre and I'm being told I have to be seen by a man, all these stories. I'm a severely disabled woman and I don't want anybody that isn't female touching me. And, these are all valid voices that had just been completely dismissed by Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, not just the SNP, by a majority in the Scottish Parliament. And that occasion was so valid. That was why it was so great that these people had that chance to come and say, my voice is valid, I need to be heard. And then a few months later, you hear, oh, it was Nazis that day. We were the Nazis in George Square that day. And you just think, Nazis? Did you listen to any of it? How dare you? How? And to hear that he got a standing ovation.
Because he said in a council meeting.
He said it in a full council meeting.
Far-right fascists.
Far-right fascists and would-be Nazis, something like that, And the folk that were affected by that, I certainly felt affected by that, that was one of the worst things. I grew up in the 50s, and one of the worst things you could be called then was a Nazi, not long after the Second World War, and people were still finding out the horrors of Nazism and what had gone on. And I remember the Sunday papers, sort of displaying some of the things that were still being discovered. And so to be called that for standing up for women's rights, it had a profound, I felt, it maybe sounds stupid, but it did have a profound impact on me. And yes, he was found to have breached the code, but and we tried our best. I think that is something I'm quite proud of. One of your things is, what are you quite proud of? That we took it as far as we possibly could to challenge. We put in complaints, written complaints to the council, and got back. Well, I got back, I think, saying, oh, well, no point complaining to the council because we're not responsible for what people say. So then the Ethical Standards Commissioner, so complaint to that, detailing and providing evidence and how it had impacted. And then it took nearly a year, I think, to get back a provisional report saying, yes, well, that maybe wasn't very nice, but, they've got rights as councillors to say things that are maybe a bit contentious or whatever. So that's it. We're not having a hearing, and this is the end of the matter. And I thought, no, no, it's not the end of the matter. And I mean, can I mention you? Or yeah, and you and Jane. There were three of us that got together and put back a reply.
Sam as well. There was there was Sam
and Sam as well. Yeah, and I remember putting back saying, look, this isn't correct. There was a few points that didn't really weren't I think correct. I looked it out. Yeah. So anyway, so there was they actually changed their minds and it went to a hearing. But we weren't invited to speak or give our views at the hearing. So we got to sit and sort of harumph and things. And the outcome was still, well, they did find that he had been in breach, but he wasn't going to be censured over it. And I can't remember all the legalese about it, but we did have a meeting. We were invited, and I was pleased about this, to the Ethical Standards Commissioner's office in Edinburgh, and I think we had an impact. But I was glad we did it, because, there's no point in sort of saying you're going to challenge things and then back, we had to see it to the end, and I'm glad we did it.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, when views are challenged, they're not intellectually coherent or backed up by evidence, but nobody is allowed to, like the no debate, no challenge, you can't, you weren't being allowed to do that. And now folk are backtracking, like the Labour Party, Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Definitely.
Oh, if only we'd known. Well, you would have known if you'd listened to the evidence that, for Women Scotland and Sex Matters and individuals were putting forward. You would have known. How could you not know?
Tell me about when the GRR bill was going through.
Well, I remember being through, I went through to Holyrood for a couple of things before it passed. And then I remember the day it passed, and I remember I was crying, I was here in tears. And I said, that's the end of women's rights. And my daughter said, well, I don't think so. I don't see it like that. And I thought, well, I do. And of course it is. Because you can't have women's rights if you can't define women. I mean, that's the bottom line, isn't it? That's the very bottom line.
Now, how's it changed your view of politics?
Oh, quite considerably. I mean, I was out in the 2019 December in horrible weather going round, as were a lot of women I know, going round for the SNP. And I don't believe it was I don't remember that being in the manifesto, you know. And then it suddenly was this must get through. I mean, that the very fact that they were pushing it through on late night sittings as if it was the most necessary policy for Scotland's society. You know, the drive they had to push it through. And well, obviously I came out of the SNP. I certainly wasn't ever going to support a party that didn't support women's rights and who told us our views weren't valid, you know, and was in support of rapists and women's prisons and, you know, all that goes with it. So yes, I did not vote at the last election, and I feel bad given people died for me to get the vote, but I did go and vote, and I just wrote none of the candidates here represent my views, you know. And I'll have to think careful. I'll look careful. I will vote. I would have voted SNP for Joanna Cherry. You know, I'm now more in looking at politics. I'm looking at individuals more. You know, Neil Hanvey, I would vote for him. You know, so I'm looking at individuals. Yeah, Ash Reagan. Mm-hmm.
Have you any advice for women on speaking up?
Well, I suppose, you see, my advice is coming from a place of safety in the sense that I don't have a career anymore and, you know, but I think if you've got something to say and you don't say it, you're always thinking, I wish I'd said that. I wish I had nailed my colours to the mast. I wish I had been part of that protest, or I wish I had gone to that. You know, I think instead of having those regrets, you know, everybody is with you, in the women and the folks. Never mind the folk at the back shouting or trying to drown you out with music. You know, the women there are wanting to hear you. They're there to support you. And give it a go, you know, get up there and say what you want to say, because if you don't, if you sit on it, it'll gnaw away, and you'll think I could have said something, and if things happen within your family. You know, I've got grandchildren, and I worry about them. And I think if I don't do something to counter this ideology, if I don't speak and make my views known, it's just going to carry on. And other folks, you know, my family could get swept up by it. And then I'll think, what was I doing? What was I doing? I wasn't doing anything. I was just reading my books, or, you know. And I need to be out there, and I can. You know, I don't. I'm not going to be cancelled. So I do understand folk that have to be circumspect about revealing themselves and making their views known. But if you can. Never mind if you've never been a public speaker or addressed people. You've got something to say. So, you know, say it. Or write it. Because I write letters. That is one thing I am proud about. I used to write letters about independence. So I now, you know, I haven't written a letter for a while, but Danny Garavelli wrote, you know, Jake, when the hate crime bill came, and Danny Garavelli, she's a Scottish journalist, she wrote this, oh, how cruel of J.K. Rowling, because J.K. Rowling called out trans women as men and said, he's a man, and Danny Garavelli said, oh, this is so cruel, she doesn't need to be as nasty. So I wrote a letter that got published in the Herald, saying, no, it's cruel to women, and I listed it, and that got a bit of a response. So, yeah, and you don't need to, you could use a pseudonym or whatever if you don't want that. So, yeah, write as well. Yeah.
Has it affected your mental health, do you think, or your sense of self?
Well, yes and no. Yes, I mean, in a positive way, because I think, well, I must be doing something positive, for people to sort of think about me in a positive way. That's good. But I must say, before the Aberdeen rally, because it's Aberdeen, and because I knew because I knew that there was a lot of negativity being posted beforehand, and because I knew that I might know some of the folk posting it, and who might turn up, I was nervous, I was anxious. I would say I was very anxious in the days before, and my daughter here was saying, "Well, you don't need to go. You don't, why are you going? Don't go." And I said, "But no, I have to go. I'm not going to go because they've posted, that the Nazis are coming." And that's what they were posting, the KJK and their Nazi followers, it's ridiculous. Yeah, so, and then it wasn't as well policed as Glasgow, but it was a very, very good weekend. It really was. So my mental health improved. Yeah, my mental health improved.
You've been listening to Unsilenced Project.